In early 2022, when Russian armored columns crossed the Ukrainian border, many observers felt they were witnessing a scene from a bygone era of war. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of tanks advancing in dense formations, evoking Cold War-era tactics. Within days, videos of burning T-72 tanks and ambushed convoys flooded the internet. Javelin missiles, NLAW anti-tank missiles, and Turkish Bayraktar drones destroyed armored vehicles with stunning efficiency. It was undoubtedly a wake-up call. Were tanks becoming obsolete in modern warfare? Yet looking ahead to 2024 and beyond, the picture becomes far more complex. Despite the vulnerabilities exposed by the war in Ukraine, nearly every major military power continues to order, upgrade, and deploy tanks. The United States is undertaking large-scale modernization of its M1 Abrams main battle tanks. China debuted its next-generation Type 100 tank and Type 99B main battle tank at this year's September 3rd parade. Germany has received orders for 400 Leopard 2 A8 main battle tanks from 7 countries. Russia, defying sanctions, has accelerated production of the T-90M tank, targeting an annual output of 1,000 units by 2028. Even Israel, renowned for its innovations in urban warfare, relies heavily on its battle-hardened Merkava tank. Clearly, there are still those who believe in tanks. So what lies behind this confidence? This video aims to explore the complex and often contradictory role of tanks in modern warfare. After watching, you may find that the question of whether tanks still matter is far less straightforward than much of the quick-take media coverage would have you believe. Tanks first appeared on the battlefield during World War I, moving slowly and experimentally through the trenches of Europe. But it was World War II that truly allowed tanks to shine. From the Soviet T-34 to the German Panther and Tiger tanks, these armored machines often determined the outcome of entire campaigns. Blitzkrieg and rapid advance warfare relied heavily on fast-moving armored divisions as vanguard forces to launch offensives, break through enemy defenses, and sow chaos behind enemy lines. In fact, some historians still argue that the Eastern Front of World War II was, in many respects, a tank war. This period saw tank warfare evolve rapidly and brutally, with both sides racing to develop stronger armor, more powerful guns, and more reliable machines. Fast forward to the Gulf War of 1991, and the narrative of tank dominance reached another peak. American M1 Abrams tanks, equipped with advanced targeting systems and heavy armor, destroyed Iraqi armored forces with near-surgical precision. Many engagements ended before the Iraqis could even react, and the Abrams versus T-72 matchup became a technology showcase. To many military planners at the time, it was hard to imagine a future battlefield without tanks. Of course, these historical moments also reflected the strategic environments of their time. Open terrain, large-scale conventional battles, and relatively clear front lines. And that is where the story begins to shift, because the nature of war itself changed. From the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq in 2004 to the Siege of Mariupol in 2022, today's conflicts rarely unfold on desert plains or frozen steppes. Instead, they tend to occur in densely populated urban warfare environments, where insurgents, drones, and precision-guided weapons have replaced mass tank assaults. This shift prompted some to ask, if tanks were once the kings of open-ground warfare, are they now merely large, vulnerable relics in an era dominated by asymmetric combat and anti-tank weapons? Despite tanks' long dominance on the battlefield, the recent Russia-Ukraine conflict has thoroughly called into question their survivability and relevance. Since the war began in 2022, both sides have suffered devastating tank losses. According to the Oryx website, as of October 1, 2025, Russian forces alone have had 3,127 tanks confirmed destroyed with photographic or video evidence, including 95 advanced T-90M models. Ukraine has had 986 main battle tanks destroyed, including 10 M1 Abrams, 11 Leopard, 2 A6, 2 Challenger 2s, and 3 Swedish STRV-122S, among other advanced types. Yet paradoxically, given the enormous scale of tank destruction, Direct tank-on-tank engagements have been rare on the Ukrainian battlefield. Among the many weapons responsible for destroying tanks on both sides, drones are undoubtedly the cheapest and most lethal. Both Kiev and Moscow have made extensive use of first-person view FPV drones. These drones are so densely present over the battlefield that nearly every time a tank appears near the front line, swarms of them converge to attack. There is no tank that cannot be destroyed. There are only inexhaustible drones. If one doesn't finish the job, send 10. If that's not enough, send 20. No matter how thick the armor, no tank can withstand that kind of sustained assault. Loitering munitions, artillery, and anti-tank missiles are also significant weapons for destroying main battle tanks. In many cases, the destruction of tanks has been filmed and widely shared online, shaping international perceptions of tank vulnerability. Of course, this is nothing new. During the peak of the Syrian civil war and the ISIS insurgency, tanks also suffered heavy losses, particularly in urban environments like Aleppo or Palmyra, where Syrian Arab army forces and rebel groups alike found their tanks struggling to cope with terrain they were never designed for. Narrow streets, concealed ambush points, and ever-present anti-tank weapon threats. In urban environments, tanks lose many of their core advantages. Their powerful long-range guns are difficult to employ effectively in confined spaces, and their limited fields of view make them heavily dependent on infantry support. Without that combined arms coordination, even the most advanced tanks become easy targets. In this sense, urban warfare is an extremely hostile environment for armored vehicles. Then there is the logistical burden. Tanks are not just battlefield equipment. They are massive engineering projects requiring constant fuel, maintenance, and crew training. Even something as straightforward as transporting tanks over rough terrain puts enormous strain on supply lines. In Ukraine, muddy roads and drone surveillance have severely compromised mobility, and keeping tanks operational has become a major logistical challenge. A significant portion of tank losses on the Russian-Ukrainian battlefield have come not from enemy fire, but from mechanical breakdowns, abandonment, or recovery failures. Critics argue that the combination of cost, vulnerability, and operational complexity makes it increasingly difficult to justify tanks in modern warfare. If a soldier can destroy one with a $30,000 missile or a $500 drone, why invest tens of millions of dollars in a single armored vehicle? Despite the constant viral footage of burning tanks on the Ukrainian battlefield, the world's militaries have not abandoned armored warfare. In fact, some have doubled down. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. After all, tanks have appeared quite fragile in recent conflicts. But for many commanders, the answer is not to abandon tanks entirely, but to rethink how they are used. The core advantages of tanks remain unmatched by other platforms. They combine mobility, protection, and firepower in a way nothing else can. Tanks can traverse rough terrain, absorb hits that would destroy lighter vehicles, and deliver devastating strikes against fortified positions. Under the right conditions, this combination still produces what might be called a shock effect, a psychological and tactical advantage capable of collapsing unprepared defenses. But modern warfare is no longer about tanks acting alone. It is increasingly about combined arms coordination. In joint operations, tanks no longer charge blindly forward. They fight alongside infantry, drones, engineers, and artillery in tightly coordinated attacks. The Israeli military's operations in densely populated areas like Gaza or southern Lebanon are a prime example. Merkava tanks are rarely deployed without infantry cover and continuous drone surveillance. Infantry protect the tanks from close-range threats like rocket-propelled grenades. Drones provide forward reconnaissance, and artillery suppresses enemy strongpoints. When properly coordinated, this combined approach can significantly reduce the risks tanks face when operating alone. Even in Ukraine, where tanks have suffered heavy losses, some units, particularly those supported by reconnaissance drones and modern artillery, have still been able to use armored assaults effectively to exploit weak points in enemy lines. Tanks remain critical for breaking through enemy defensive positions, providing sustained fire support in ways that infantry simply cannot replicate alone. Tank technology is also evolving to counter threats. Some countries are now equipping their main battle tanks with active protection systems designed to intercept incoming threats. Israel's trophy system, for example, has proven its effectiveness in combat, using radar-guided countermeasures to defeat rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles. Russia has developed the Arena system, while the United States is testing systems like Iron Fist for its M1 Abrams. While these systems are not foolproof, they represent a significant leap forward in tank survivability. Research into thermal signature reduction, emission control, and even drone tank integration is also underway. Some experimental units are testing drones launched directly from tanks to provide immediate aerial reconnaissance. This allows tank crews to act faster and more precisely beyond traditional blind spots like buildings or forests. Crucially, tanks still play an important psychological role on the battlefield. Their presence alone can force enemies to retreat, slow an offensive, or divert resources. In certain tactical situations, especially on open terrain or in fast-moving operations, heavily armored vehicles capable of breaking through resistance and holding ground may simply be irreplaceable. That said, no one claims tanks are invincible, and no one believes they can perform the same role they did during the Gulf War. But declaring them completely obsolete may be premature. Tanks are not dying. They appear to be evolving, adapting to a world where they are no longer the centerpiece of the battlefield, but rather a critical component of a broader, more complex combined arms system. Despite early setbacks, both Russia and Ukraine continued to use tanks throughout the war, and in considerable numbers. In major offensives and counteroffensives alike, tanks remained a central element of combined arms operations. During Ukraine's summer 2023 counteroffensives in Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk, for example, Ukrainian forces used Leopard 2 and T-64 series tanks to attempt breakthroughs of Russia's dense minefields and fortified defenses. Russia, for its part, deployed modernized T-90M tanks and even a small number of T-14 Armata prototypes for defensive and limited offensive tasks. What is truly worth noting is not simply that tanks continue to be used in the Russia-Ukraine war, but that the way they are being used is constantly evolving. Both sides appear to be learning, adapting, and rethinking tank doctrine in real time. One key adaptation is hull-down positioning, tanks using terrain to expose only their turrets while concealing the more vulnerable hull. This centuries-old tactic has found renewed relevance on a battlefield saturated with drones and precision-guided weapons. In areas near the Crimea forests or the flatter terrain around Robotyn, tanks have been observed using ridgelines and tree lines for cover, briefly exposing themselves to fire before rapidly withdrawing. Another tactical shift is the increasing use of tanks in nighttime operations. With improvements in thermal imaging equipment, tanks can now operate effectively in darkness, generally avoiding the drones and loitering munitions so prevalent in daytime combat. Ukrainian tank crews in particular have reported frequently maneuvering at night, repositioning under cover of darkness to avoid detection and strike targets with a degree of surprise. Perhaps the most significant evolution is the growing emphasis on coordination between tanks, infantry, and drones. Neither side can afford to send tanks into combat without multi-layered support. Ukrainian forces routinely use small commercial drones to scout routes, locate enemy anti-tank missile teams, and relay real-time footage back to tank crews and infantry squads. Russian forces have adopted similar drone scouts to guide tank fire or coordinate with artillery. This tight coordination, though not always successful, reflects a recognition that modern tank warfare requires combined operations across multiple domains, including cyberspace, electronic warfare, and unmanned systems. While these adaptations have not eliminated losses, tanks on both sides continue to be destroyed, sometimes in large numbers. The shift shows that commanders have not given up on tanks, but are redefining their role within the broader strategy. They are no longer seen as behemoths of the battlefield, but as fragile, yet indispensable assets whose survival depends on careful planning, support, and the skillful exploitation of terrain, timing, and as technology. So while the role of tanks in the Ukraine war may look different from their classic form in the Gulf War or World War II, it undoubtedly represents a new chapter, one in which flexibility, coordination, and adaptability may matter just as much as armor thickness or gun caliber. From NATO's perspective, tanks are still considered essential in conventional warfare. General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, noted in a 2023 briefing that despite heavy losses in Ukraine, armored forces remain critical for seizing and holding ground. He emphasized that NATO doctrine continues to revolve around combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, drones, and artillery operating in close coordination, a philosophy that has influenced procurement strategies across member states. Countries like Poland have ordered hundreds of M1 Abrams and K2 Black Panther tanks, while Germany has invested heavily in the next-generation Main Ground Combat System, a joint development project with France. On the American side, the Pentagon has acknowledged tanks' vulnerabilities, particularly in urban warfare and asymmetric conflicts, but has stopped short of declaring them obsolete. A 2022 RAND Corporation study found that tanks still hold significant value in peer-on-peer conflict scenarios, especially in maneuver warfare where armored striking power and survivability are critical. However, the study also recommended that future tank designs must prioritize mobility, network integration, and modular protection over sheer armor thickness. Notably, U.S. Army doctrine is already shifting. In the wake of events in Ukraine, there is growing emphasis on integrating drones and active protection systems into armored brigades. Retired Lieutenant General Scott McKean, one of the architects of the Army's multi-domain operations concept, noted in 2023 that tanks are no longer the centerpiece of a combat formation. They are part of a combined arms system in which information speed and coordination often matter more than brute force. In Russia, the situation is more complicated. On one hand, Russian forces remain heavily reliant on tanks. Despite enormous losses, Russia has continued to deploy modernized tanks like the T-90M and has invested in high-profile projects like the T-14 Armata, which features advanced technologies including an unmanned turret and sophisticated sensors. But even within Russia, there are private acknowledgments that tank warfare must evolve. Russian military commentators such as retired colonel and defense analyst Mikhail Kodarinok have stated that tanks must now be viewed as part of a layered protection system, not as the tip of the spear, but as a support element for infantry and drones. Critics, including some Western experts, go further, arguing that while tanks can still function in conventional conflicts, their high cost, significant visibility, and vulnerability to anti-tank weapons substantially diminish their utility in modern hybrid warfare. Nevertheless, few experts are calling for tanks to be phased out entirely. Instead, a growing consensus holds that the future of armored warfare depends on innovation, smarter integration with digital systems, better protection against drones and missiles, and flexible designs tailored to specific environments, particularly urban and contested terrain.